Hey everyone, it's Last Protagonist. Recently, Zizaran had an interview with game directors Jonathan Rogers and Mark Roberts talking about the speed of Path of Exile 2, and unfortunately it seems as though Ziz and Jonathan talked past each other a little bit and tended to focus on enemy speed in relation to the players, which I do think is an important metric to talk about, and I do think some good improvements have been made on that front already, but I don't think this really hit on the issue that many players were thinking about when the topic of speed was initially brought up. And so hopefully by creating a video like this, it'll give players a bit more tools to give proper feedback to the developers moving forward. So this is kind of an arbitrary list and a breakdown of the concept of speed as it pertains to the game. So I have speed being broken down to action and movement, time to kill enemies, time to clear zones and areas, a sense of progression, whether that be clearing zones or the progression of your character, and time versus reward, which also ties into progression as well. So there might be some other topics that I don't hit on because this is such a huge topic, so bear with me here if you don't mind. Alright. So moving into action and movements, I broke it down even further to first talk about action speed. So things like attacking, casting spells, how long it takes to perform certain combos or swapping weapons, things like that. And this can get interrupted by enemies attacking the player, knocking them around, what have you. And action speed and cast speed is really going to come down to balance and iterating things with item design and stuff like that. So all the black points on this Miro board are essentially just like talking points, and the red ones are possible ways that these could be addressed. Now, these aren't like true suggestions to grinding your games as much as they are highlighting how these things could potentially be dealt with, and just keep that in mind. So aside from action speed, we also have things like movement skills, which does obviously tie into action speed. But compared to Path of Exile 1, there are much fewer movement skills in Path of Exile 2, which can cause a little bit of points of friction, which can make the game feel a little bit slower as a result. So for example, whenever you have ground hazards on the ground or certain choke points where you can't get through, or on-death effects, which makes things like traversing through areas more challenging, you can't necessarily leap slam over everything or flame dash as frequently as you could in Path of Exile 1. So while leap slam is still a thing in Path of Exile 2, it's just not nearly as common as the types of traversal tools we had in PoE 1. Another thing which could tie into movement in general, is if you're playing a melee class and a boss spawns a kind of a caustic ground beneath them or some type of hazard on the ground, and you can't displace them, that could make your interaction with that boss slow down if you're melee and trying to work around the things on the ground. So one possible way to fix that would be having displacement effects where you could push bosses around a little bit more frequently, and that's not always feasible, obviously. Or having more effects like consecrated ground, which can overwrite the ground hazards. That'd be a potential fix. And obviously this is going to take a lot more iteration on the part of the devs, which they said that they're looking at, so we'll just have to wait and see what they do with movement skills if they want to incorporate them further into the game. Moving from movement skills into movement speed, you have things which can affect movement speed like passive tree, the implicit modifiers on your boots, or I guess those are technically explicit, but anyway, checkpoints and teleporting between maps, in areas and maps more specifically, as well as enemy movement speed and skipping certain content in the campaign if you're not interested in that. So, like Jonathan and Mark were saying, they were aware that some of the monsters became too aggressive and could easily swarm the player, so they tried to tune those back. I do appreciate Jonathan giving a bit of a pushback to Ziz and saying that they want monsters to feel fast, so that way players can't just skip content, which is trivial. And then I also respect Zizaran's point that because this is an ARPG, players are already incentivized to group up monsters and beat them for their experience and their loot. I think there is validity to both points, but solving this issue is going to be very difficult because some players feel a little bit too pressured early on by swarms of monsters, and the question then becomes, is it because the monsters are too fast, or is it the players' skills are too slow to deal with that? And would these fast monsters be a problem if they were trivial to kill? So Mark was saying maybe you only have really fast mobs be weaker, and then the more dangerous ones will be slower and catch up to you as you deal with the weaker ones first. I think these are all very interesting questions, and trying to figure out this problem and how to solve it. So some other points of feedback that could potentially help this issue of movement speed is having more redundancy in movement passives on the skill tree. So that way, if you're a warrior, you're not completely screwed by having no movement passives on your tree, or having runes which could give you movement speed, even if they're only boots only, that could help. Or even potentially having charms that work out of combat or actively, which can increase your movement speed if you're out of combat or something like that. I don't think this is the most elegant solution though, because I feel like players would probably manually start swapping out charms, which is a viable strat, but could just end up becoming a bit more tedious than truly intended. Then we also have some archaic effects or draconian effects, like having armor penalties on movement, which could potentially be removed. I don't know if that'll make the game feel better, but I do note that this is certainly a sore spot for characters like warriors who are likely to stack armor and things like that. So as I brought this up a moment ago, time to kill I think also plays a really big role in the overall feel of the speed of the game. And I broke this down into two sections between the campaign and the endgame. Ultimately, it comes down to balance and scalability of the time to kill enemies. And I have the parry problem as kind of being the genesis point of why I even created this video. So for many players who've played ARPGs for a while, they may have seen the parry skill get shown off in the Dawn of the Hunt trailer and immediately thought to themselves, yeah, that's not going to work in the endgame. And so far it seems that they're right. Unless there's some crazy tech that I don't know about with parry, it just cannot scale reliably into the endgame to make it worthwhile for the vast majority of players. So it raises the question, if this is really only going to be viable in the early portions of the campaign, and it's completely useless in the endgame, why did they take the time to create this at all? Well, I do think there's a lot of value in having the freedom to kind of experiment and create these kind of mechanics, and this isn't to say that it couldn't be improved. Like maybe if you added a guard bubble to parry that whenever enemies broke your ward barrier, whatever you want to call it, it gave you the parry charges. That could be one way to alter things, but the important thing is, because parry doesn't work in the endgame, is this going to be emblematic of how they see the endgame working in the future? Is the current version of the endgame compatible with skills like parry? And if they are creating skills that are not compatible with the endgame, what are they doing? So this essentially just created a smokescreen in terms of what players are expecting from the developers in terms of the overall direction of the game, and more specifically the endgame as time goes on. So is surprisingly an anthill of a problem being made into a mountain because of the overall implications it presents to players, believe it or not. So going back into the main topic of time to kill enemies and things like that and scalability, first we should talk about skills. Skills can be gated by things like unlock requirements, level attributes used to cast spells or skills, and so that has an overall effect on the player's perception of the speed of their progression of their characters and things like that. And the most important aspect of a skill and their time to kill comes into their viability, as I call it. And viability to me comes down to scalability of both damage and their area of effect, which are influenced by things like support gems, passive trees, uniques, etc. If you have a skill that can kill a boss in one hit, it can still have a good spot in the game in terms of being viable. Or if you have a screen clearing skill, that is also going to be very viable. And the issue then becomes, what if you have a screen clearing skill that can clear bosses? If you have that, then why use anything else? So for example, Lightning Spear is a very good skill because even though it does have a kind of inherent drawback of needing frenzy charges to activate at maximum efficiency, that can be worked around with certain tools that become available to the player later on in the game. Whereas other skills like Rapid Shot, which can generally only strike one target at a time until you start adding in things like forking or chaining or piercing rounds into the mix, it just does not have the same vectors for scaling both its damage and area of effect like Lightning Sphere does. So even though it can be viable, it seems as though it's not viable just because of how strong Lightning Spear is right now. If devs want more options to be viable, they'll need to figure out different ways that they can scale damage to make these options more attractive, or their area of effect. whether that be adding in more projectiles or forking or chaining or other ancillary effects like exploding enemies on death. Those are all things that they consider. When you have extremely low time to kill enemies, this really makes the combo gameplay become mostly irrelevant unless that combo is a combo of one skill, aka Lightning Strike, because why would you bother using 2 skills to kill an enemy when you can kill it with 1? Why use lot skills when few do trick? That also ties into things like cooldowns of skills and the sustainability of the skills with their charges. So Lightning Spear is self-sustaining by the virtue of the way that it can generate frenzy charges later on in the game, whereas something like Fangs of Frost, the cold spear skill, is not sustainable because you need parry charges of all things to get it into its final form. So if the devs were iterating items and creating alternative ways to get parry charges or other types of charges, maybe it could become more viable, but as it stands right now, it doesn't look like it's going to be. So then this all raises the question, can combos be properly balanced against non-combo skills? So generally, if you want to have a non-combo skill, it probably shouldn't deal as much damage as a fully fledged combo, but that's all going to take a lot of time and work in balancing and adjustment, not just on the skill side of things, but also with interactions with gear as well. Gear obviously influences the time to kill enemies and makes the game feel faster the better gear you have. So things like your equipment, as well as your gems, your support gems, your skill gems, etc. And of course your passive tree giving you stats to work with to make everything work together. And that, as always, will take balancing and iteration. Not much needs to be said on that front. Now, another vector which I think is important with the time to kill is actually the player's time to be killed by enemies. And so enemy damage killing a player is really important because if you get killed by enemies in one hit, that will heavily incentivize the player to kill all enemies before they have a chance to hit them, which definitely affects the speed of the game. And that is also expressed through access to defenses, whether that be through gear or the passive tree or the viability of armor, evasion, energy shield, etc. And then another component of this, I think, ties into the legibility of abilities and the player's innate abilities to move out of damage zones or dodge enemy attacks, essentially, and like positioning, essentially. This all needs to be adjusted with balancing patches and things like that. There might be arguments to be made that certain things need to be redesigned, like defenses and the viability of armor, but in order to make that work, it'll take a huge time investment. So with the devs saying that they don't understand why armor doesn't work as well as they would have expected it to, I think some players may have taken that a little bit disingenuously, and they're saying, oh, the devs don't understand that this is a problem. I think it's just a problem of communication where they need to understand first why armor isn't performing up to their expectations, and then how could they implement a version of armor that meets everybody's needs in terms of the player's needs as well as the devs' needs in terms of adding like friction to the gameplay to make it actually feel good. So moving on from that point, time to kill enemies obviously plays directly in time to clear zones, and this feels very different going from the campaign to the endgame, to the point that I almost feel like the way that the campaign is balanced almost feels completely at odds with how the endgame is balanced in terms of clearing zones and how long it takes to go through them. So before getting into all that, let's first talk about things like zone sizes, map completion, objectives, enemy encounters, and things like that. I guess I'll talk about that more when we get to progression, so I'll leave that alone for now. So anyway, going back to the zone sizes, some sizes of zones in the game do feel a little bit too big, mostly in Act 3, and then moving beyond that into maps. Although I do think that this feeling has gotten better now that our completion objectives for maps has become clearer with the addition of having rare monsters indicated on the minimap. I think that's a very positive change in terms of making maps go by much faster. And of course, we have things like map layouts that are worth considering, and things like the density of the content in said maps or zones if you're in the campaign, I guess. For example, if you're in a place like Mire where it has a bunch of windy little paths that you need to go through, and it's really easy to miss certain enemies as a result because you don't know the layout of where they're going to be, that can make traversing such maps more tedious than it would be if it was an open map like Savannah. So content density would be things like how many packs of enemies there are, how much bonus content there is, whether it be Delirium, Breach, Expedition, and then of course how much time it takes to clear that additional content, Rogue Exiles, etc. Completion objectives can be changed in multiple ways, like having the rare show up immediately is really good. There's also like killing bosses or reaching the end of the precursor tablets zone in the towers. So this could be changed, like maybe if you wanted to focus your Atlas on like getting essences, it'd be nice if we had more options to affect things like that. Enemy encounters, I talked about a bit with enemy density and the enemy speed, which we mentioned earlier with like the werewolves, and of course the time it takes to kill individual enemies and packs when clearing zones. Backtracking can be an issue, but it might also be worth considering whether or not is it backtracking that's actually the issue, or in certain instances the player's light radius not being large enough for them to be able to see the points where they want to go on the map. So, as I was saying a moment ago, I do think there's a really big disparity between the way that the campaign plays and the endgame, and that if the endgame is intended to remain in the current state that it is right now, you don't need to do as much iterating, but I feel like meaningful combat, as the devs like to refer to it, will kind of die because you're essentially being thrown into an arms race against the enemies, and it's generally safer for players to kill enemies before the enemies kill them, which is always true, but it gets exacerbated when enemies can one-shot you, and the current density of enemies being able to do that just kind of encourages players to do a very heavy screen clearing type of playstyle, which I think is completely at odds with the combo-based game style that's present in the very earliest parts of the campaign. That goes back into the parry problem that I mentioned before. It's completely not viable in the endgame because it can't scale to deal with the swarms of enemies, and the timing of it just... you can't really time anything when you're trying to look at 50 monsters barreling down on you at once. One question that I do have is that, do the devs not understand some of the problems in the public realm of the game because of the tools that they have access to on the dev builds, because they have more content that the players haven't seen yet? I do legitimately wonder if things feel a lot better on their internal builds of the game, and that's why there's this little bit of a disconnect, it seems, between how the player base is perceiving the game versus some of the developers. So, if the endgame is intended to remain in the state that it is, we might need more Atlas tools to make going through zones feel a little bit better in terms of having more rewards or more content, which will come with leagues and things like that. So I'm not really too worried about that in the grandest scheme of things. But as you get to the end game, it might also be nicer for the overall feel of the speed of the game if we had a clearer path of progressing through the end game, rather than just relying on the RNG of figuring out where things are on the Atlas. So this has been improved by having more zones show up in the Fog of War, like towers. I think now they just added like the corrupted nexuses showing as like red glowy dots, which I hadn't noticed before. Anyway, this will all take a lot of balancing to fix the state of the endgame if it's intended to be as quick as it is right now. But like I said before, if this is truly the intended state of the endgame, I do think meaningful combat will die once players more or less like reach Act 4 and beyond. If the devs don't want this and they want to keep the endgame feeling more like the early points of the campaign and retaining the feeling of meaningful combat, then I would argue that they really need to consider increasing the time it takes to kill enemies. Then if they increase the time to kill enemies, the maps are going to be way too big and feel like way too slogs for the psychological sense of progression and the overall speed of the game, and they should probably lower enemy densities and increase rewards in proportion to all that, which will take a ton of balancing, and of course, continuing to iterate and add more tools, which is the same as all these other suggestions over here. And this might allow players to have a more combo-focused playstyle, which isn't to say that you can't have any combos going on right now. Like, the current build that I'm using is using armor-piercing rounds and consuming that so I can spam explosive rounds, and it works well enough. But if they want to have the endgame feel like the campaign, this will be a hugely time-costing endeavor, and I don't think we're going to see it really come to fruition until maybe even 1.0 if they ever get it to this state within the early access period. As I've been hinting toward this section of the speed breakdown here, we have our sense of progression in terms of our character sense of progression and the overall feel of progressing through zones throughout the campaign and the endgame. So I think Trials is a good bridge gap between time to clear things as well as progression, because this is where you get your ascendancy node that overall affects the power of your character. Sometimes negatively if you're the Blood Mage right now, believe it or not. And anyway, for your character's sense of progression, I think there's a really good balance in the campaign because you're going to be gaining levels very consistently that will contribute to your passive tree, as well as skill books from quest rewards, and that all feels really good early on. But as you progress further and further into the endgame, you might start encountering a lot more friction in terms of fighting enemies that might be able to one-shot you, or even if you don't get one-shot, if you just start dying, you're going to incur experience penalties, and that'll slow down your sense of progression. Now, I'm not saying that they should take away the experience penalty or anything like that. I'm just saying that this does have an impact on the overall feel of the speed of the game and the progression of your character. Obviously, as you play through the game, the gear is going to have a huge impact on the player's sense of progression, and gear is also influenced by the amount of levels that you have because they come with stat requirements. The same is true for skill gems and support gems, and I already mentioned quests, and getting some gear from quests in terms of support gems or spirit gems especially can influence how good it feels to go through the campaign and killing enemies and things like that. Drops, I think, is important because when enemies drop things, it feels like you're making progress with your character, whether it's currency, whether it's gear, which upgrades your build. This can make the game feel faster, even if you aren't playing the game any faster. This actually becomes really apparent when you compare how people feel about Act 1 versus Act 3. It actually takes people the same amount of time to go through Act 1. Maybe I'm misremembering. At the very least, Act 1 might be the same length as Act 3, which might not make much sense because I believe Act 1 technically has fewer zones. At the very least, they definitely have smaller zones than Act 3. But most people start to really complain about zone sizes in Act 2 and Act 3 when they're essentially spending more time, proportionally speaking, in Act 1. So, ironically enough, being able to go through zones quickly doesn't actually make them feel nearly as good, which is why I tend to disagree a little bit with what Jonathan was saying, that they need to make zones more interesting if players don't like being in the campaign for as long as the devs want them to. I think there's a little bit of a push and pull between that, because while there is a lot more density to the areas in Act 1 and you do get a lot more rewards to make it feel better, I would still say that the actual map sizes in Act 3 feel a little bit long and become a bit fatiguing. I don't think adding more to them will make them feel as good as in Act 1, but that's a little bit beyond the point right here. So as you continue to progress your character, another point which can affect your overall feel of progression is whether or not you want to reroll your character. And this is just kind of one facet of the game. Is it easy to reroll your levels, your passives? Is it easy to get different gear? Maybe, maybe not. This is just overall what contributes to a player's perceived feeling of speed in the game. One thing that the devs might want to consider doing is introducing crafting or league mechanics earlier to make some of these progression curves feel a little bit more smooth. So for example, right now you can only use the Expedition or Combinator after you complete the campaign, which I don't really have strong feelings about one way or the other. But of course, once they start adding in more crafting items later on, maybe this will not become important at all. Going into the whole zone thing, as I'd mentioned before, the campaign feels really good in Act 1 for the vast majority of players, it seems, whereas Act 3 feels too long. Act 1 feels really rewarding, and Act 3 feels long despite having access to more skills and potentially lower time to kills enemies and lower time to clear zones as well. So another thing that I want to bring up in relation to the campaign are the concepts of linearity and redundancy. Throughout the campaign, a lot of zones are very linear, and you can't super easily skip content that you're not very interested in for a number of reasons. Some of that is map layout, and another reason would be that certain forms of side content effectively become mandatory content because of the rewards associated with that quote-unquote side content. So for example, if you wanted to get the 2 passive skill points for killing the Quadrilla in Act 3, then you would go out of your way to kill the Quadrilla to get the skill points. Now, what if that kind of reward was made redundant and you could obtain that reward from killing Doriani and you could effectively skip the Quadrilla or maybe even the Survey quest or what have you just by playing the game? I think this could be good for both sets of players who want to blast through the campaign as well as those who like to explore, because those who like to explore would receive an immediate power spike to their build, whereas those who blast through the campaign can shorten their time going through the campaign as well as enjoy the delayed gratification of receiving those rewards later in an effectively weakened state when they clear that content. Linearity can be adjusted in terms of like map layouts by having more direct access points from point A to point B, and that isn't always feasible for the zones like the canal zones. It's very linear, it can be very tedious, and I don't know the best solution for that, other than having like bonus content there that makes players want to stay in that zone. So I don't really think this is the easiest thing to fix, despite how easy it sounds and to say such things. In order to balance a lot of the zones in the campaign, you need to do a bunch of targeted balancing by reducing some map sizes, adjusting player and monster balancing in terms of like player speed, monster damage, player damage for your time to kill enemies, time to clear things, etc. Moving into the endgame, a lot of your progression comes down to what you get from your Atlas passive tree, which means you want to clear as many objectives to get as many passive points as possible, because this will allow you to juice your maps better to get better rewards from them, which I do think is a little bit at odds with the desire to stay underneath the maps to get those rewards from the juiced up maps. And it seems as though the devs are going to continue iterating on this. So I'm not too worried, but just want to bring this up for now because it's relevant right now. So as you go throughout the endgame and get into maps and try to climb to the highest tiers of maps and do pinnacle content, you are going to run into what I call the build checks and knowledge checks. So build checks means, do you have the requisite stat points to clear the content before the content clears you? So do you understand how to make builds properly? Do you understand how to farm currency to make your proper build? Things like that. As you get into the end game, because it becomes non-linear in terms of the way to progress other than just exploring essentially, you have a less clear path of progression than the campaign, which isn't necessarily good or bad, but it is just kind of a fact of the matter. And the current state of the Atlas is heavily dependent on RNG, where things appear on your map. So maybe some players will get unlucky and have to explore much longer than others. That always sucks. And that especially rears its head when you're trying to do pinnacle content naturally and not like trading for items. So that way you could go fight the Arbiter of Ash early from like getting the tokens and whatnot. If a player doesn't understand how to progress their build, or they don't have the knowledge to kind of maximize what they have with their build with things like item rarity to get better drops or things like that, then they might feel the need to turn to guides and outside resources to help direct them where they need to go, which will slow down their effective progression because they'll need to take the time to look that stuff up to begin with. But I mean, sometimes that's just part of the game. But I do think this is a real thing that should be considered in topics of speed and progression in general. In terms of balancing the zones for progression, you need more targeted balancing. You need to reduce some map sizes and, of course, player and monster stuff, as in everything else. Then another aspect could be increasing player agency by having redundancy in quest rewards and having skippable content, like I talked about, like Doriani and the Quadrilla example. Or, for instance, right now, when I was going through the maps on my current character, I got to tier 15 maps and was still trying to clear either tier 3 or tier 4 corrupted nexuses because it was a little bit difficult for me to find them or to like get there, or maybe I just had a strong enough build where I could get to T15s pretty quickly. And so it felt really awkward trying to get more passive points when they weren't really relevant to my current power level. So why couldn't I just have put in a tier 15 node to do it in a corrupted nexus to get my maximum Atlas passive points from that? That'd be worth considering as well. I do think the current endgame progression is a little bit better than what it was before, but obviously it still needs some work, which I think mostly everyone would agree on. Improving Atlas passive rewards, I think this is important because right now you kind of have to play the Atlas more or less the same way as everybody else in terms of progressing it. Whereas in Path of Exile 1, you had more options by the virtue of what rewards you could get out of your Atlas. So one of the best ways to progress your build early on, if it wasn't that strong, is that you could essentially stay in tier 1 maps and clear them for essence mobs and continue running maps for the essences essentially and leave before even like fighting the bosses to fully clear the maps, because you can sell your essences for currency in trading, and then you could use the currency from that to incrementally improve your build. Whereas Path of Exile 2 doesn't quite have anything which can enable that kind of divergent playstyle from just doing most difficult content as you possibly can. So one question that Jonathan brings up in relation to this topic in general is, why do players want to skip content? Shouldn't they just make that content better? I definitely understand and appreciate that concern. However, I think there are multiple axes here where you can't really please everybody because one size fits all doesn't truly apply. You can't adequately give people the same amount of rewards if they like to blast through as much content as possible, or if you have people who take their time and enjoy what they're doing and explore slowly, because one playstyle is just way more efficient at clearing content than another. So can this be balanced? I don't necessarily think adding more content makes it better for people who just want to clear content as quickly as possible. So I think ultimately it comes down to a lack of player agency to influence what they necessarily want to do, whether that be in the campaign or in the endgame. So I think just having more tools to allow players play the way that they want to will help, whether that be making maps easier to get from point A to point B and clearing that content first. But anyway, beating a dead horse. So adding paths for deterministic progression can be good, and that might be something worth considering more in the future, especially if you're trying to get all 3 different types of citadels to just fight the Arbiter of Ash and whatnot. So very strongly tied into progression is what I will call time versus reward, and these two topics are more psychologically relevant to speed. This is more in the player's mind than anything else. As it stands right now, I think the campaign is really streamlined because you get a lot of crest rewards, you level up very quickly, etc. And that makes things feel very quick in terms of the speed of the game, despite technically how slow it is going through Act 1 and all that. Once you get to the endgame, the guardrails really come off and your path for progression becomes really unfocused. You're just kind of praying for RNG to bless you with things like audiences to the king, expedition logbooks, breaches, delirium, so that way you could progress that, as well as even finding corrupted nexuses to get more Atlas passives and things like that. And because of that, I think there's a much slower sense of progression because you're not gaining levels as quickly. You're probably not getting gear as quickly unless you're trading for it, which is perfectly fine. But I'll go on my soapbox tangent for a while about that in a moment. Loot also plays into this as well, the time versus the reward. So sustaining maps in terms of getting consistent waystone jobs, Jin Barrias if you wanted to farm Trials of Sekima, or inscribed ultimatums for Trials of Chaos, that plays into like the sense of the smoothness and the speed of the game. And risk versus reward is really important because right now you don't necessarily tie map difficulty to map reward, whereas that was more directly the case in Path of Exile 1, where the more mods you had on your map, the more quantity and rarity you got implicitly from that. So this doesn't feel very balanced right now. And some other aspects of loot and quality of life, or the tedium of the game, ties into things like going back to your hideout and taking time to disenchant and sell gear or post gear on the trade site. Definitely slows down the overall pace of the game if you're doing that very, very often and whatnot. More quality of life focused things in terms of making the game feel more tedious than it otherwise would need to be would be going to the reforging bench, the salvaging bench, the disenchanting vendor, and not necessarily having things like vendor recipes, because in Path of Exile 1 you could sell 5 items of a type to a vendor and then they'd give you one back. So even though you need less items to do that with Reforging in Path of Exile 2, you first need to individually put in 3 items at one time, press the Reforge button, loot your new item, then put in 3 more and rinse and repeat, and that gets really tedious when it was just kind of all automated from Path of Exile 1. So it'd be nice if they had like both options available, but anyway. Another thing which is very tedious is that you need 300 breach splinters to make the breach stone, whereas why did they settle on the number 300? It just seems to be a legacy pullover from Path of Exile 1. Maybe there's a real reason behind that, I don't understand, but I would go so far as to argue that you could reduce the amount of breach splinters to pick up to 100, 2 for every 1, just get rid of them, and it would feel a lot better. But I would also press that even further and say, well then why stop there? Why not just make it 10 breach splinters to create a breach stone and just kind of reduce the amount that they drop? Because this is very tedious. It'd also be nice if the breach splinters all congregated at the end of the breach once it like closed. And that also ties into things like expedition chests. It's really tedious opening them individually. Sometimes they're easy to miss, especially if you're not running a loot filter and you have all these other points of text on the screen. And then, of course, Path of Exile doesn't have an auto sort button or an auto stash button, and if you could sort things in your stash and your inventory or like lock certain things in your inventory, that would be quite nice and definitely help speed up the game rather than making it so tedious, essentially playing inventory Tetris. Going back into the gigantic topic of RNG in terms of time versus reward, because it's all dependent on RNG, the overall feel of progression in the endgame can be all over the place. Like if you get a really good drop very early on, that can kind of steamroll you into the future and you'll be set up for life essentially. Or if you just kind of get unlucky or die a couple times, you might get set back quite a bit. And it's just very inconsistent up until the point where you know very well what you're doing and how to make the most out of the in-game systems. So there are a couple ways that this could be addressed in terms of crafting and vendors. So having access to more currency to craft things could be good. There's also the availability of gear, because right now, like most of the gear that drops in the endgame is going to be absolutely garbage, which kind of necessitates loot filters. And I know the devs said originally they didn't want to have loot filters, which just kind of sounds preposterous now when you actually look at the state of the endgame, because yeah, you kind of need that. Otherwise, enemies are going to be hidden behind the loot on the ground, essentially, and that can feel really bad if you can't see what the hell is going on because of so many irrelevant items populating the screen, which is something I'm very familiar with because I don't use the loot filter, just so I have a better baseline understanding of how new players to the game are going to feel. So anyway, moving on from that, these are also concerns in the early game versus the late game. So for example, balance I think is really going to be all over the place in terms of what feedback the players give to grinding gear games, mostly because of RNG. Now, I've touched on this in previous videos before, but basically, if somebody running through the campaign starts off getting a plus 20% movement speed boots from the very first vendor, they're going to have a completely different perspective on the campaign than somebody who doesn't get movement speed on their boots until Act 3. Whether or not they're checking the vendors or they don't know about that, it's kind of irrelevant. My point is, the balance is all over the place because there isn't really a consistent baseline because everybody is just at the mercy of RNG. So if vendors were able to give players gems, or if players were able to disenchant their current gems, that might be a way to help even the playing field, because a lot of a player's power progression is kind of limited by their access to things like gems and support gems. And if bosses are kind of balanced to be challenging to players who have like the optimal skill setup, then players who don't meet that threshold are going to feel excessively challenged. Or if the bosses are balanced to the lowest common denominators, then they're going to feel like jokes to players who have better gear and better builds. So I think it would overall be better for the game if vendors in the early game sold gems, and or if you could disenchant gems, so that way the devs had a more balanced playing field in terms of that kind of feedback. To tie into that, I don't think Shisa ruined Path of Exile 1. He's the gem vendor. You could essentially get almost every gem from him in the game at about like the midway point through the campaign, and it always felt really nice to get to him because that's when you knew your build could finally get fixed from RNG. So anyway, Some other things pertaining to crafting, which I know the devs have said they're working on, is like giving more artifice slots to equipment, but I don't think that feels really good. In the end game, I've already got like 100 regal orbs just from like salvaging gear, but I've only got like 20 artificing things because they deliberately stopped to start picking up items with sockets and disenchanting them so I could get more artifice things. So it just feels really tedious to have to pick up 10 socketed items essentially to get one socket on another item. Granted, we're not really upgrading our gear super often, but it just doesn't feel super good to me right now. The rune changes are nice to an extent, so that way you could equip your low level equipment with lower runes and not really feel too bad about wasting them because they're not going to scale into the end game. I think that was a kind of a positive change. And then all of the things pertaining to crafting and vendors also comes with the knowledge check of knowing to check your vendors regularly, as well as the understanding of how the crafting system works, which right now it's super basic in the current form of the game, so this isn't really that big of a deal right now. But this does get more complicated the further and further you go, especially if you start trying to do things like omen crafting and stuff like that. Obviously, if RNG is a problem and that really affects the player's sense of progression and it gets slowed down because they just don't know how to make their build work or their knowledge of the game isn't the best, one way to counteract this currently in the game is through the determinism that trading brings to the game. Trade does offer an alternate progression path to the game, which can definitely help alleviate some of the slower feel of the game once you get to the end game if you're able to make incremental improvements to your build. But this also paradoxically slows down the game because you'll be spending less time playing it directly as much as you will be fiddling with trade itself, like selling items onto the trade site versus buying them, visiting other people's hideouts, them visiting yours, bringing you out of maps, things like that. And trade comes with its own set of difficulties in terms of introducing that which is the thief of all joy comparison to a player's build. So once you realize, like, hey, maybe my build isn't as good as I thought it was, oh man, these items are so much better, I can't afford them, that could make players feel bad and make them want to put down the game. But this doesn't truly tie into the overall speed of the game. This is just kind of more of a psychological effect of understanding the time it would take to upgrade your gear, put in the perspective of trade and farming for currency specifically. Now, trade itself also comes with a bunch of knowledge checks and skill checks because it's kind of easy for some people to get scammed if you're not paying attention. There's also the issue of etiquette. Etiquette for trading, so like if somebody posts a trade and you offer them, you go to their hideouts and they don't visit you, so things like that. This will only get exacerbated once the game goes free to play, and generally speaking, I don't think a lot of players are really happy with the current state of the trade. I don't know if an auction house is going to be better or not. It'll definitely streamline things, but then it might show other problems inherent in the game which aren't as obvious right now. So anyway, one of the most important things to me is that if the game is truly balanced around trade and that's how you're supposed to upgrade your gear in the end game, then ground loot must come to the player in a pre-nerfed state, because the overall numbers of players getting items which are going to be fantastic for somebody else's build, but not their own, will skew the relevancy of gear into winding up in the wrong pair of hands, i.e. not your hands. And so if progression becomes trade focused, then farming strategies become trade or currency oriented, which is fine to a degree. But this also introduces its own set of knowledge checks in terms of like how to farm efficiently for currency and things like that. And this could definitely slow some people down. And the people who understand the systems the best will amass the most wealth, which could be good or bad, depending on whether or not the economy gets inflated, which does seem to be a really big problem in Path of Exile 2 as the leagues go on. Maybe because there's not enough currency sinks to offset the cost of many things. All of this aspect of trading being problematic and RNG being problematic will become exacerbated once new base types are added into the game. So right now, if you're playing a monk and you're using quarterstabs and you get pissed off every time you see a crossbow drop for you, just remember it's going to be worse once you start adding in items like swords, daggers, claws, etc. Another thing to consider with trade is that the natural progression of the game, I think, does feel destroyed a bit if trade is cheap. So if you're in, like, say, T4 maps and you're like, oh man, I'm kind of struggling, maybe I should look at this trade site and see what I can get right now. And then you buy 10 Chaos Orbs worth of gear and all of a sudden you're just catapulted up to tier 15 maps. I don't think that feels very good. But on the flip side, I don't really think there's a viable way for players to just kind of farm the game reliably on their own to have a good sense of progression as it is. So for right now, I think this is a kind of necessary evil if you want to actually progress your character, or if you are a bit of a masochist, you can play SSF and find everything yourself. So on the flip side of this, if trade is too expensive, then you can't meaningfully progress your gear, which will make the game feel much, much slower as a consequence of that. So if you're one of those players who never finds a div at a time, definitely understand the pains of this. One of my bigger complaints about trade and progression is that this kind of ties the individual's progression to a player-tied economy, which just kind of feels at odds with the way the rest of the game is presented to me. But maybe you guys feel differently, and if so, you could totally ignore this section of the video. And then, as I mentioned before, what do players do if and or when the economy does become inflated and it costs 200 Exalted Orbs to buy like a Perfect Jeweler Orbs, which it's currently at right now, and it's only a couple weeks into this league. So it's going to take a lot of players a lot of time to farm that amount of Exalt if they're not getting those Perfect Jeweler Orbs themselves. All of this, I think, brings up the question of whether or not this is truly a trade issue or is this all a loot issue? Because you don't necessarily have to go to the trade side if you're getting loot that's plentiful enough for your needs. So this might not even be a big deal at all. I'm just bringing this up in the whole context of the feeling of player progression and speed. Another question I have is trade a positive experience? And more importantly, is it a necessary experience? If you, the audience, do think that trade is positive, why, I ask? Is it just because of the loot that you're getting? And if loot is the answer, then why not make ground loot better? So if you enjoy like going to players' hideouts or trading with a friend, like co-op, I think that's perfectly well and good. Just like the whole anonymized visit a rando's hideout from the trade site and dealing with that. Do you guys really think that's the best form for the game? That is a legitimate question. Please feel free to leave your answer in the comments. So, is the website the best form of the trade, or would the game be better for having an auction house? This obviously comes down to individual opinion. I do think that the current form of trading makes it so that the game is slowed down substantially because of how much time you need to leapfrog back between your hideout and maps and into your stash tab and all that. And of course, trade makes things that become more of a single individual player's concern into a more global MMO-centric one when you're dealing with so many other random players. And of course, this is very easy to throw shade on the whole trading system and the RNG side of things when there might be a legitimate business concern for having the game set up this way in terms of encouraging players to buy stash tabs for interacting with the trade site, and so perhaps a truly deterministic crafting source for the game is not actually the way forward, even though I would probably enjoy the game more if that was implemented. Some of the last questions that I have pertaining to RNG and trade is, can RNG compete with the determinism of trade? With the way that the game is currently set up, I don't think so. Otherwise, players who play SSF would be encouraging it much more rapidly than they are, which most people that I understand play SSF think that the game is kind of broken for that playstyle. Then, should there be more deterministic progression in the game, and if so, where? I think that the endgame could use some help, but that's kind of more of an individual question for you guys. And then, is there a system where the rich won't continue to get richer if trading is the way to go? I think you can potentially have that if passives are more powerful than gear, but then that also raises the question, would that even be good for the game? Is it the game overall better if trade is better, especially in terms of like business concerns for the company? Another thing to consider is that the only way that this is a problem of the rich getting richer is if it has a negative impact on players, and arguably we could say that that might be a concern based on how much the economy gets inflated and how prohibitively expensive it is to do things like omen crafting much later on. I do realize that this section of the video took up quite a large amount of time, which seems a little bit imbalanced compared to everything else, but I mean, really, once you get to the end game, the vast majority of your game time will probably be trade-centric. So anyway, if there's anything you guys think I forgot about in terms of the speed or the balancing of the game, let me know. I've tried to be as inclusive as I could, but I feel like I've forgotten things because I've had to remake this video a couple times now. And yeah, if you've watched to the end, I want to thank you very much for doing so. And I also want to thank my patrons and channel members for their continued support in allowing me to kind of create these random videos on the fly. So if you guys have any comments, let me know. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed this. And hopefully we will now be able to, as a community, provide a little bit more pointed feedback about what about the speed of the game that we like or dislike to help advance the discourse and steer the game into a more positive direction in the future. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hopefully I'll catch you on the next one. So until then, take care, stay safe. Last Protagonist out.